For 187 days, Maya Reyes did one small kind thing in a world that had offered her very little of it. Buried under a mountain of debt for her mother's care, working double shifts at a greasy spoon diner, her own future felt as bleak as the Chicago winter. Her act of kindness was a nightly offering of leftovers and a warm cup of coffee to the crippled beggar huddled in the alley. He was a ghost of a man with haunted eyes and a past he couldn't remember. She called him Joseph. Then, on the 188th day, as her world was about to completely shatter, he looked at her, his eyes clear for the first time, and uttered the 9 words that would either save her or destroy her. "My name is Nathaniel Kane. I am a billionaire." The stench of stale beer and damp cardboard was the official perfume of the alley behind the corner spoon. For Maya Reyes, it was the scent of exhaustion. Every night at 11:05 p.m., after wiping down the last sticky table and counting out her meager tips, she would push open the heavy metal door, and the smell would greet her like a grim familiar friend. And so would he. He sat propped against the grimy brick wall, a man who seemed to have been stitched together from discarded things. His coat was a patchwork of tears and hope, his beard a matted testament to forgotten time. One of his legs was twisted at an unnatural angle, held stiffly in a makeshift brace of wood and filthy rags. But it was his eyes that held Maya captive. They were a faded, stormy grey, and in their depths she saw a profound emptiness, a void where a life used to be. The regulars and staff called him Twitchy Joe because of a nervous tremor in his left hand. Maya, in the privacy of her own thoughts, called him Joseph. It felt more dignified. Their ritual began on a freezing night in March. Maya had been berated by her boss, Mr. Henderson, for dropping a plate. Her tips were insultingly low, and she'd just gotten off a call with the collections agency for St. Jude's Medical Center, their voices like polite, cheerful vultures. She was holding a plate of half-eaten meatloaf and congealed gravy destined for the dumpster. As she swung the bag towards the bin, she saw him shivering violently, his face pale and gaunt in the dim security light. Something inside her, a stubborn ember of compassion that refused to be extinguished by her own hardship, flared. She walked over, her heart thumping. "Excuse me," she had said, her voice barely a whisper. "Are you hungry?" He flinched, his grey eyes widening with the fear of a startled animal. He didn't speak, just gave a slow, hesitant nod. She placed the styrofoam container in his trembling hands. From that day on, it became their unspoken contract. For 187 days, through the last bite of winter and the deceptive warmth of spring, Maya fed him. Sometimes it was just fries and a half-eaten burger. On good nights, when a customer left a barely touched steak, she felt a surge of triumph. She would add a hot coffee paid for from her own tips, knowing it meant she'd be taking the late bus instead of the train. "You're wasting your money, Maya Brenda," a fellow waitress with a perpetually sour expression would sneer. "He probably makes more in a day than you do just sitting there." "It's a scam." Maya would just shrug. "He's hungry, Brenda." "And you're a sucker." Maybe she was. Her life was a ledger of deficits. Her mother, Maria Reyes, was wasting away in a long-term care facility, a victim of early-onset Alzheimer's that had stolen her memories and her vitality. The cost was astronomical, a crushing weight that Maya bore alone. Her father had vanished when she was 10, leaving behind nothing but a faded photograph and a legacy of debt. She lived in a shoebox apartment in a rough neighborhood where the sirens were her nightly lullaby. Her dreams of being a graphic designer were locked away, gathering dust like the old portfolio under her bed. Yet feeding Joseph felt like the one transaction where she came out ahead. In his quiet, grateful nods, she found a flicker of meaning in her Sisyphean existence. He rarely spoke. His words were disjointed, like fragments of a shattered mirror. He'd sometimes whisper about towering glass and the sound of numbers, or complain of a phantom pain in his head, a buzzing of angry bees. One rainy Tuesday in September, as she handed him a container of shepherd's pie, his trembling hand brushed against hers. A strange jolt like static electricity passed between them. He looked up, and for a fleeting second, the fog in his eyes cleared. The numbers? They have to balance, he whispered, his voice raspy but clear. The asset column must always equal the liability. Meyer froze. It was the most coherent sentence he had ever uttered. It sounded like something a businessman would say, not a man living in an alley. "What did you say?" she asked, leaning closer. But the moment was gone. The fog rolled back in, and his eyes became vacant once more. He just stared down at the food, his hand resuming its familiar tremor. Meyer stood there for a long time, the rain soaking her thin jacket, a strange and unsettling feeling coiling in her gut. Brenda was wrong. This was no ordinary beggar. This was a man with a ghost inside him, and she was beginning to think it wasn't the ghost of a poor man. The unsettling clarity in Joseph's eyes that night lingered with Meyer for days. It was like seeing a crack in a dam, a hint of the immense, powerful force held back by a wall of confusion. She started paying closer attention, listening not just to his mumbled words, but for the spaces in between. The pressure in her own life was escalating. The facility director at her mother's care home, a stern woman named Mrs. Gable, had called again. "Ms. Reyes," she'd said, her voice devoid of sympathy, "we are now 2 months behind on payments. We value your mother as a resident, but we are a business. If the account is not brought current within 30 days, we will have to initiate transfer proceedings to a state-funded facility." Meyer knew what state-funded facility meant. It was a place where hope went to die, understaffed, underfunded, and impersonal. The thought of her mother, already lost in the labyrinth of her own mind, being subjected to that kind of neglect, was a physical pain. It meant she had to find another $12,000 in less than a month. An impossible sum. It might as well have been $1 billion. That night she was a wreck. Her hands shook as she poured coffee, and she snapped at a customer who complained his soup was cold. Mr. Henderson pulled her aside. "Reyes, what's with you tonight? You're on thin ice. Go take your break." She fled to the relative peace of the alley, sinking onto an overturned milk crate, her head in her hands. She didn't have any food for Joseph. She'd been too distracted to save anything. She just sat there, silent tears tracing paths through the grime on her cheeks. After a few moments, she felt a presence beside her. It was Joseph. He had shuffled over from his usual spot and was standing over her, a look of profound concern on his face. It was the most animated she had ever seen him. He reached out his trembling hand, not to take but to offer. He patted her shoulder clumsily. The gesture was so unexpected, so deeply human, that a sob escaped her lips. "It's nothing," she choked out, wiping her eyes. It's everything." He didn't speak. He just stood there, a silent, ragged sentinel. Then he looked up at the sky, at the single bright star that had managed to pierce Chicago's light pollution. "Cassiopeia," he rasped. Meyer looked up, confused. "What, in the north sky?" he said, his voice surprisingly steady. My father showed me. On the boat. The Stargazer." He frowned, a flicker of pain crossing his face. The name on the back of the boat. "Cocaine." The name hung in the air, a strange and alien sound in the grimy alley. Cain. It meant nothing to Meyer, but the effort it took for him to dredge it from the depths of his broken memory was immense. He swayed his face, paling, and leaned heavily against the wall. "Are you okay, Joseph?" She asked, her own problems momentarily forgotten as she stood up to steady him. He just shook his head, the confusion returning. "Head hurts. The bees. They're so loud." The incident solidified a new, terrifying conviction in Maya's mind. This man was not born to this life. He was a refugee from another existence, one with boats named Stargazer, and fathers who taught their sons about constellations. The name Cain echoed in her thoughts. It felt important, heavy, with a significance she couldn't grasp. A few days later, the first hint of violence arrived. Maya was leaving the diner when she heard a commotion from the alley. 2 young men, reeking of cheap liquor, were cornering Joseph. "Come on, old man, we know you got something," one of them sneered, kicking at Joseph's outstretched legs. "People give you handouts all day." Joseph cowered against the wall, shielding his head with his arms. A primal protective fury surged through Maya. "Hey, leave him alone!" She yelled, her voice shaking but loud. The men turned, their expressions a mixture of surprise and contempt. "Mind your own business, waitress," the bigger one said, taking a menacing step towards her. Before Maya could react, something shifted. Joseph, who had been a whimpering ball on the ground, moved with a speed that was utterly shocking. In one fluid motion, he hooked his good leg around the bigger man's ankle, twisted his body, and sent the man crashing to the pavement. The second man lunged, and Joseph's hand shot out, not with a tremor, but with a precise, calculated strike to the man's throat. It wasn't a punch. It was a disciplined, targeted blow that made the man gag and stumble back, gasping for air. The 2 would-be muggers scrambled to their feet and fled, casting terrified glances over their shoulders. Maya stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. She stared at Joseph, who was now back against the wall, breathing heavily, his body trembling. But this time, it wasn't from weakness. It was the aftershock of adrenaline. The vacant look was gone, replaced by a sharp, terrifying awareness. "Joseph, how did you do that?" she whispered. He looked at his own hands as if they belonged to a stranger. I don't know," he stammered, the fog visibly descending again. "They were a threat. The protocol. Neutralize the threat. Protocol neutralize the threat." The words were clinical, detached, the language of a soldier or a security expert. It was another piece of the puzzle, another glimpse into the man locked inside the beggar's shell. Whoever he was, he had been trained. He was a fighter. And someone somewhere had taken it all away from him, leaving only the instincts behind. The 30-day deadline from the care facility felt less like a calendar and more like a guillotine descending one day at a time. Maya picked up more shifts, working until she was a walking ghost, fueled by caffeine and desperation. Her conversations with Joseph in the alley became the only calm in her storm. She told him about her mother, about the bills, about her suffocating fear. He couldn't offer solutions, but he listened, his grey eyes reflecting her pain. He was her silent confessor. The day everything changed was a Wednesday. It was grey and drizzling, the kind of day that mirrored Maya's soul. The diner was slow. The small television bolted to the wall in the corner was on tune to a 24-hour news channel. Maya was refilling salt shakers, her mind a million miles away, calculating figures that never added up. Brenda, polishing cutlery with a vengeance, snorted. "Get a load of this. They're still talking about that billionaire guy who went missing, like anyone cares." Maya glanced up at the screen. The story was a retrospective. A polished news anchor was speaking over a series of photographs. "It's been 6 months since the shocking disappearance of Nathaniel Cain, the enigmatic CEO of Cain Global Enterprises," the anchor said. Last seen leaving his downtown office, Kane vanished without a trace. While law enforcement has scaled back the investigation, his younger brother Gideon Kane has vowed to never give up hope. A photograph flashed on the screen. It was a professionally shot headshot of a man in a sharp, tailored suit. He had a strong jaw, dark, intelligent eyes, and an air of intense focus. He looked powerful, confident, and impossibly wealthy. Maya dropped the salt shaker. It hit the floor with a clatter, spilling a white cloud across the linoleum. Her blood ran cold. The face on the screen, it was older, cleaner, sharper, but it was him. It was Joseph, the same stormy grey eyes, the same distinct shape of the brow, the scar faint, but visible on the high-resolution photo just above his right eyebrow, was identical to the one she'd often seen on Joseph's forehead when he pushed back his matted hair. Kane, the name he had whispered. Her heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of her chest. She stumbled towards the television, her gaze locked on the screen. They showed another photo, this one, of Nathaniel Kane stepping out of a helicopter, and another laughing with politicians. He was a titan of industry, a name synonymous with innovation and ruthless business acumen, and he was living in an alley behind her diner. She felt dizzy, a roaring in her ears. She had to get to him. She ripped off her apron, ignoring Brenda's squawk of protest and Mr. Henderson's angry shout. "Maya, where do you think you're going?" She didn't answer. She burst through the back door and into the rain-slicked alley. He was there in his usual spot, huddled under a small overhang. "Joseph!" She gasped, her breath coming in ragged bursts. He looked up, his expression placid and unknowing. "Your name," she said, crouching in front of him, her hands on his shoulders. "Is your name Kane?" He flinched at the name, a flicker of something pain recognition fear crossing his features. "Kane." He repeated the word, a foreign object in his mouth. "The bees, so loud when you say it. Look at me," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "Please try to remember. Nathaniel Kane." She held his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her gaze. She described the man on the television, the helicopter, the powerful company Kane Global Enterprises. With every word she spoke, she could see a storm gathering behind his eyes. The fog was thinning, swirling, being burned away by a sudden violent heat. His body went rigid, his hands clenched into fists. A low groan escaped his lips. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. I'm Joseph." "No, you're not," she insisted, tears streaming down her face, mingling with the rain. "You're someone else, someone important." It was then that the news report from the diner's TV, the sound of which was faintly audible through the open door, began a new segment. The anchor's voice drifted out into the alley. And in business news, Kane Global's stock took a slight dip today after acting CEO Gideon Kane announced a delay in their much-anticipated Project Chimera. The phrase Project Chimera was the key. The moment the words hit the air, Joseph Nathaniel cried out. It was a raw, agonized sound. He clutched his head, his eyes squeezed shut. "Chimera," he choked out. "My project, my data, the encryption. Gideon!" His eyes flew open, and for the first time the fog was completely gone. The vacancy was filled with a terrifying, razor-sharp intelligence. He wasn't looking at Maya anymore. He was looking through her at a world she couldn't see, a life of unimaginable complexity flooding back into his consciousness in a brutal, crushing wave. The memories, the boardroom battles, the scent of his leather office chair, the face of his brother, twisted not in grief but in triumph, it all came back. He stared at his filthy clothes, at his trembling, grimy hands. He touched the matted beard on his face, a look of pure horror dawning. He looked at the alley, at the dumpster, at the life he had been living for 6 months. The shock was a physical blow. He finally focused on Maya, his gaze so intense it felt like a brand. He saw her, truly saw her for the first time. The worn-out waitress uniform, the exhausted hope in her eyes, the woman who had shown him kindness when he was nothing. He opened his mouth, his voice no longer the rasp of a beggar, but the clear, resonant baritone of a CEO. It trembled with the shock of its own rediscovery. He spoke the words that tore a hole in reality, the 9 words that ended one life and began another more dangerous one. "My name is Nathaniel Kane," he said, his voice shaking with the force of his own identity, crashing back into him. "I am a billionaire." The silence that followed Nathaniel's declaration was heavier than any sound. The rain, the distant city, hummed the clatter from the diner. It all faded away, leaving only the two of them in the grimy theater of the alley. Maya stared at him, her mind struggling to reconcile the man she knew as Joseph with the titan of industry, now looking at her with eyes that burned with a terrifying lucidity. Nathaniel's own shock was quickly being replaced by a cold, pragmatic urgency. The memories weren't just returning, they were slotting into place, forming a horrifying picture. He remembered the meeting, the argument with his brother Gideon, the accusations of embezzlement. He remembered leaving the office late, the sharp, sudden pain at the base of his skull, the feeling of falling, and then nothing. A 6-month abyss. "They tried to kill me," he whispered, the words laced with icy venom. Gideon. The name of his brother was a curse. Gideon, the charming, ambitious younger brother, had always lived in his shadow. Now it was clear he had orchestrated a coup, not just for the company, but for Nathaniel's very life. The amnesia, the crippled leg, it was all a result of the attack. He'd been left for dead, and by some miracle had survived, his identity shattered. "We have to go," Nathaniel said, his voice gaining strength. He tried to stand, but his atrophied muscles and injured leg betrayed him. He collapsed against the wall, a groan of pain and frustration escaping his lips. "He'll be watching. If there's any news of my return, he'll finish the job." Maya's mind, which had been frozen in disbelief, snapped into action, her own problems the debt. The hospital seemed small and distant compared to the life-or-death situation that had just exploded in front of her. "Okay," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Okay, we'll go. Can you walk?" "I have to," he gritted out. Using her as a crutch, Nathaniel Kane, a man who commanded a global empire, took his first agonizing steps out of the alley that had been his prison. Every part of him screamed in protest. He was weak, malnourished, and disoriented, but the fire in his eyes was the fire of a king reclaiming his throne. "My wallet, my phone, everything is gone," he said, as they shuffled into the street, the rain plastering his thin hair to his scalp. "I have nothing. I have $74, Maya said, without hesitation, "and a bus pass. It'll have to be enough." They were a strange sight, the disheveled waitress and the ragged beggar moving with a shared purpose through the indifferent city. Nathaniel's mind was racing, processing threats, calculating risks. Gideon would have eyes everywhere. The company's security, his personal accounts, his known associates, they would all be monitored. Going to the police was too risky. Gideon had deep connections and could easily paint Nathaniel as a delusional, mentally unstable imposter. "We need a place to disappear," Nathaniel said. "Someplace cheap, anonymous." Maya knew just the place. The Starlight Motel, a dingy establishment on the outskirts of the city, where the neon sign flickered apologetically, and the management prided itself on asking no questions. She used her cash to pay for a room for one night. The room was small and smelled of bleach and despair. There was a lumpy bed, a stained armchair, and a television bolted to the dresser. For Maya, it was a step down. For Nathaniel, it was an alien planet. He stared at the peeling wallpaper as if it were a complex equation he couldn't solve. The first thing they did was get him into the shower. Maya waited outside the bathroom door, her ear pressed against the cheap wood, listening to the water run. She heard a heavy thud, followed by a curse. She pushed the door open to find him slumped on the tiled floor, the shower curtain ripped from its rings. He had tried to stand on his own and failed. Without a word, she helped him up her face, burning with a mixture of embarrassment and fierce protectiveness. She supported his weight as he washed away 6 months of grime, the water swirling grey and dark down the drain. It was a moment of profound, awkward intimacy. She wasn't helping a billionaire, she was helping a broken man. Later cleaned and dressed in spare clothes she'd bought from a 24-hour convenience store, clothes that were too small and made of cheap polyester, he looked less like a beggar and more like a man who had survived a shipwreck. He sat on the edge of the bed, his brow furrowed in concentration. Gideon is smart, but he's arrogant, Nathaniel said, thinking aloud. He would have covered his tracks, rerouted funds, created a new narrative. He thinks I'm dead. The moment he learns I'm not, he'll become a cornered animal. As if on cue, the television in the room, which was playing the same news channel from the diner, flashed a breaking news banner. It was a live press conference. Gideon Kane stood at a podium, his face a mask of somber concern. To answer your questions, Gideon said, his voice smooth and reassuring, the board and I have decided that in the wake of my brother's tragic extended absence, it is in the best interest of Kane Global to officially move forward. Today I am reluctantly but resolutely stepping into the role of permanent CEO. Nathaniel watched his expression turning to granite. He's making his move, consolidating power. We have to stop him, Maya said. To do that I need proof, Nathaniel countered. Proof of the embezzlement that I confronted him about. Proof that he tried to kill me. Right now it's my word, the word of a man who's been living on the street against his. Suddenly Nathaniel's eyes widened. He looked at Maya, a new, more immediate fear in his gaze. He'll look for me, but he won't know where to start. So he'll look for loose ends, for anyone who might have seen me or helped me. He paused, the implication hanging heavy in the air. The diner, the waitress who was always kind to the beggar in the alley. Maya's blood turned to ice. She had never felt fear for herself like this before. The problems of money seemed trivial compared to the threat of a man who would try to murder his own brother. Brenda saw me leave in a hurry, she whispered. Mr. Henderson, too. Nathaniel's phone, a cheap burner Maya had bought with the last of her money, rang. It was an unknown number. Her hand trembled as she answered and put it on speaker. Is this Maya Reyes? A man's voice asked. It was cold and professional. Who is this? She asked, her own voice barely audible. My name is Mr. Flint. I represent an associate of your mother's care facility. The voice lied smoothly. There seems to be an issue with her account. I need to meet with you in person to verify some details. A misunderstanding, I'm sure. I'm just outside your apartment building. Nathaniel grabbed the phone and ended the call. His face was pale. They found you. That fast. They're not from the facility. They're his men. We have to leave. Now. They didn't even pack. They slipped out the back window of the motel room just as a sleek black sedan, the kind that belongs in a politician's motorcade, pulled quietly into the front parking lot. 2 men in dark suits got out. They weren't there to discuss billing errors. As Maya and Nathaniel scrambled over a chain-link fence and disappeared into the labyrinth of the city's underbelly, she realized the truth. She hadn't just saved a man. She had stepped into his war. and now she was being hunted too. The next 48 hours were a blur of motion and fear. They moved through the city like ghosts, using buses and walking through crowded parks, never staying in one place for more than a few hours. Nathaniel stripped of his wealth, and power was a liability in this world. He didn't know how to navigate the transit system, how to blend into a crowd, how to look unassuming. His posture, even in his weakened state, screamed authority. Maya, on the other hand, was in her element. The world of scarcity and survival was her home turf. She was the one who bought them food from street vendors, who found them a place to rest in a 24-hour library, who taught Nathaniel how to ride the subway without drawing attention. Their roles had reversed. He, the architect of a global enterprise, was now utterly dependent on her, his guardian angel, in a worn-out waitress uniform. They found refuge in a forgotten corner of the city, a small, independently owned bookstore run by an elderly man named Mr. Abernathy, for whom Maya had occasionally run errands. He was a kind, eccentric soul who loved books more than people and asked few questions. When Maya appeared with a gaunt-looking Nathaniel claiming he was a cousin who'd fallen on hard times, Mr. Abernathy simply nodded and offered them the small, dusty apartment above the shop. "The rent is keeping the shelves stocked with first editions," he said with a wink. "Stay as long as you need." For the first time in days, they were safe. The apartment was filled with the comforting smell of old paper and ink. It was there, surrounded by the silent wisdom of thousands of books, that the real work began. Nathaniel's physical recovery was slow and painful. His leg needed proper medical attention, but a hospital was out of the question. Maya used her meager knowledge to create a better brace and used hot compresses to ease the muscle atrophy, but his mind was recovering at a blinding speed. Gideon was always sloppy with details he considered beneath him, Nathaniel said one evening, pacing the small living room like a caged tiger. He's a big picture man, a charmer. The dirty work, the digital trails, he would have outsourced that. He would have used a ghost. He explained to Maya the intricate corporate structure of Kane Global, the firewalls, the encrypted servers. It was a language she didn't understand, filled with terms like offshore shells, dark ledgers, and data mirroring. But she listened, absorbing every detail. He would have needed to siphon funds to pay the people who attacked me, Nathaniel reasoned. Significant funds, and he'd need to hide that transaction. He'd think I was dead, so he'd get careless. The proof has to be inside the Kane Global mainframe, specifically in the financial data for Project Chimera. "But how can we get to it?" Maya asked. "We can't just walk in." Nathaniel smiled, a flicker of his old, commanding self. "No, but I know someone who can." He told her about Beatrice Albright. She was the chief financial officer of Kane Global, a woman in her late 60s, with a mind like a steel trap and a loyalty to Nathaniel's father that bordered on religious. She had been with the company for 40 years and despised Gideon's flashy, reckless style. "If there is one person in that entire tower I can trust, it's Beatrice," he said. "But contacting her is the problem. Gideon will be monitoring her calls, her emails, everything." This is where Maya's world and Nathaniel's world collided. He knew the corporate strategy, but she knew the streets. "We don't contact her digitally," Maya said, an idea forming in her mind. "We use something old-fashioned." The next day, Maya went to a public library and used their computer to look up the daily schedule for a fleet of high-end corporate couriers in the city. She knew that executives like Beatrice Albright would have a routine. She spent hours observing the Kane Tower from a coffee shop across the street, watching the comings and goings. She noticed that every day, at 3:15 p.m., a courier from a specific firm, Viridian Express, would deliver a package of legal documents to the 52nd floor where Beatrice's office was. The courier was always the same young man. Maya's plan was simple and audacious. She intercepted the courier in the lobby of a nearby building, pretending to be a frantic assistant. "Oh, thank God, I caught you. Miss Albright's office just called. They need this addendum attached to the afternoon delivery. It's urgent." She handed him a sealed manila envelope. Inside there was no addendum. There was a single small piece of paper. On it, Nathaniel had written just 5 words. "Stargazer knows Cassiopeia is waiting." It was a code, a message from his past that only Beatrice would understand. Stargazer was the name of his father's boat, the boat where he, his father and Beatrice, had spent a weekend hashing out the company's future decades ago. Cassiopeia was the constellation his father had taught them both to find. It was a message from the dead. They waited the hours, stretching into an eternity. Doubt began to creep in. What if Beatrice didn't get the message? What if she thought it was a prank? What if she had already sworn her loyalty to Gideon? Just after midnight, a quiet knock came at the door of the bookstore below. Mr. Abernathy let in a stern-looking woman in an impeccably tailored suit. Her face was pale, her expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. It was Beatrice Albright. She ascended the stairs and saw Nathaniel sitting in the armchair. The formidable CFO's composure broke. Her eyes filled with tears. "Nathaniel," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We all thought you were dead." "Almost," he replied, his voice grim. "Beatrice, I need your help. Gideon has stolen my company and tried to take my life, and I'm going to take it all back." Beatrice's grief hardened into a cold fury. "What do you need?" she asked, her voice now pure steel. "Just tell me what to do." The alliance was formed. In the dusty apartment above the bookstore, the billionaire, the waitress, and the CFO began to plot the downfall of Gideon Kane. The plan they conceived was a high-wire act of corporate espionage executed from a dusty apartment filled with the smell of old books. Beatrice became their inside agent, a conduit of information and access. Nathaniel was the grandmaster, anticipating Gideon's moves, directing his pieces on the board, and Maya unexpectedly became the linchpin. Her role was born of necessity. Beatrice could access the system, but downloading terabytes of financial data would trigger immediate alarms. They needed a specific target. "Think Nathaniel," Beatrice urged during one of their late-night meetings, her face a pale oval on the laptop screen. "Gideon's payments. He would have used a project code to bury them. Something sentimental or arrogant. That's his style." Nathaniel racked his brain, but the 6-month gap in his memory was a wall. He remembered the broad strokes of his confrontation with Gideon, but the specific project numbers and codes were lost in the fog. It was Maya who provided the key. She had been listening intently, her brow furrowed. "When he was Joseph," she said softly, "he used to mumble. A lot of it was nonsense, but there were things he repeated." She closed her eyes, casting her mind back to the cold nights in the alley, to the disjointed whispers of the man she thought was a beggar. He talked about numbers. He kept saying a number, over and over. He said it was the key to the cellar. "What was the number?" Nathaniel asked, leaning forward, his eyes locked on her. 2786, she said without hesitation. Project 2786. Beatrice's eyes widened on the screen. "My God," she breathed. Project 2786 was a dead project, a feasibility study for geothermal energy in Iceland that was shelved 5 years ago. It's the perfect place to hide transactions. No one would ever look there. It was the breakthrough they needed. Beatrice, using her top-level clearance, was able to isolate the project's financial logs, and there it was. A single massive wire transfer for $2 million dated the day after Nathaniel's disappearance. It was coded as an asset disposal fee, a nonsensical entry for a defunct project. The recipient was a numbered shell corporation based in the Cayman Islands. "This is it," Nathaniel said, a grim satisfaction on his face. "This is the payment to the men who tried to kill me." But the transaction log wasn't enough. It was circumstantial. They needed to link Gideon directly to it. The final piece of the puzzle came from another of Maya's fragmented memories of Joseph's ramblings. "He also mentioned a name," she said. "He said it sounded like a snake." "Viper. No, that's not it." "Aspen." "Aspinall," Nathaniel and Beatrice said in unison. "Arthur Aspinall," Nathaniel clarified. "A disgraced ex-MI6 operative, a corporate fixer, the kind of man you hire when you want a problem to disappear permanently. He was Gideon's contact. I overheard them talking once. If we can link that shell corporation to Aspinall, we have him." With Beatrice's help, they dug deeper. They discovered the shell corporation had made a single subsequent payment, the purchase of a yacht registered in Monaco. A yacht named the Regret. Gideon's arrogance had once again been his undoing. Now they had the weapon. All they needed was the right moment to fire it. That moment came in the form of the annual Kane Global Shareholder Meeting. Gideon, now the permanent CEO, planned to use the event to unveil his new vision for the company and cement his power. It would be broadcast live, a coronation ceremony of his own design. The plan was audacious. Beatrice arranged for 2 extra guest passes for her staff. The night before the meeting, Maya gave Nathaniel a haircut, trimming away the last vestiges of Joseph. Dressed in a borrowed suit from Mr. Abernathy's long-deceased husband, he still looked too thin, too haunted. But the fire was back in his eyes. He looked in the mirror not as a billionaire, not as a beggar, but as a fighter about to enter the ring. He turned to Maya. Her own dress was simple, something she'd bought from a thrift store. To him, she had never looked more beautiful. In the quiet of the apartment, he took her hand. "Maya," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "Whatever happens tomorrow, thank you. You didn't just save my life. You gave it back to me. Just promise me one thing," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "When you get your world back, don't forget the people who live in the alleys." "Never," he vowed. The next day they walked into the Lion's Den. The Kane Tower lobby was a cathedral of glass and steel. Maya felt a wave of vertigo. Just weeks ago, she was serving coffee to people like this. Now she was walking among them, part of a plot to topple their king. Beatrice met them and whisked them through security. They took their seats in the back of the enormous auditorium as Gideon took the stage to thunderous applause. He was charming, confident, every inch the powerful CEO. He spoke of legacy of the future, of honoring his brother's memory. Nathaniel sat perfectly still, his face a mask of cold fury. As Gideon finished his speech and prepared to take questions, Beatrice signaled. On the massive screen behind Gideon, which was supposed to be showing a corporate logo, a new image appeared, the transaction log for Project 22786. A confused murmur rippled through the audience. Gideon stared at the screen, his face draining of color. Then a voice, amplified by the auditorium sound system, cut through the room. A question for the CEO. A spotlight swiveled to the back of the room, illuminating Nathaniel as he stood up. Gasps echoed through the hall. It was like seeing a ghost. "Gideon," Nathaniel said, his voice clear and strong, resonating with power. "Perhaps you can explain to the shareholders this $2 million asset disposal fee. And while you're at it, maybe you can tell them about your friend, Arthur Aspinall, and his new yacht, the Regret." Gideon was frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish, the charming facade shattered, revealing the panicked, guilty man beneath. "Security!" he shrieked. "Get him out of here! He's an imposter! He's delusional!" But it was too late. Beatrice was already handing out printed files to key board members. Maya, standing beside Nathaniel, hit send on a burner phone, emailing the entire data package to a dozen major news outlets. The king had been checkmated in his own throne room. As security guards, followed by the police, Beatrice had discreetly called, moved towards the stage, Gideon's reign came to an abrupt and spectacular end. In the chaos, Nathaniel's gaze found Maya's across the crowded room. It was over. They had won. The aftermath was a whirlwind of headlines, legal proceedings, and corporate restructuring. The story of the billionaire who returned from the dead was a media sensation. Gideon Kane was arrested, his crimes laid bare for the world to see. Arthur Aspinall was apprehended in Monaco, his yacht ironically providing the final nail in the coffin of Gideon's lies. Nathaniel Kane was reinstated as CEO of Kane Global Enterprises, his return hailed as a corporate miracle. He moved back into his sprawling penthouse apartment overlooking the city, a world of bespoke suits, fine art, and unimaginable luxury, and for a short while it felt to Maya as though she had simply been a character in someone else's fairy tale. And now that the story was over, she was expected to return to her own life. She went back to her small apartment, back to her job at the Corner Spoon. Brenda was uncharacteristically silent, staring at her with a mixture of awe and terror. Mr. Henderson awkwardly tried to give her a promotion. The first sign that things had changed was a call from Mrs. Gable at the care facility. Her voice, usually so cold and clinical, was now syrupy sweet. "Ms. Reyes, wonderful news. An anonymous benefactor has settled your mother's account in full. In fact, they've endowed a fund for her continued care indefinitely. She's been moved to our premier suite with a private nurse." Maya knew instantly who it was. The relief was so profound it brought her to her knees. The mountain of debt that had defined her entire adult life had vanished. A few days later, a long black car pulled up outside the diner during her shift. The door opened, and Nathaniel stepped out. He wasn't wearing a suit, but a simple sweater and jeans. He looked healthier, stronger, but his eyes were the same ones she had come to know in the alley, thoughtful and intense. He walked into the diner. The handful of customers fell silent. Brenda dropped a coffee pot. "Maya," he said, his voice soft enough for only her to hear. "Can we talk?" She took off her apron for the last time and followed him out. They didn't go to a fancy restaurant or a corporate office. He drove them to a small, quiet park. "I've been busy," he said, an apology in his voice, untangling the mess Gideon made. "I understand," she said, though a part of her had feared he would simply forget. "No," he said, turning to face her. "You don't. The past few weeks, being back in that world, it feels wrong. Empty. I spent years building an empire of glass and steel, of assets and liabilities, and in the end, none of it could save me. A cup of coffee and a container of shepherd's pie from a woman who had nothing. That's what saved me." He reached into his pocket and pulled out not a diamond ring or a check, but a set of keys and a thick folder. "I dissolved my personal venture capital fund," he explained, "and I used the capital to start something new. It's a non-profit foundation. Its mission is to provide direct aid for people crushed by medical debt, to fund homeless shelters that focus on rehabilitation and mental health services, and to offer scholarships to people who had to give up on their dreams because life got in the way." He handed her the folder. The name on the front read, "The Reyes Foundation." "I'm the money, Nathaniel," he said, "but you're the heart. I want you to run it, as my partner." Maya was speechless. She looked from the folder to his face. She saw no pity in his eyes, only a profound respect. He wasn't offering her charity. He was offering her a purpose, the one she had unknowingly been searching for her entire life. "My world doesn't need another billionaire," he continued, his voice filled with a conviction that resonated deep in her soul. "It needs more people like you. Your kindness, Maya. It's the only currency that actually matters. It's the only thing that's truly real." She didn't find her happy ending in a penthouse or a palace. She found it in a modest office, helping a single mother avoid bankruptcy, securing a warm bed for a man who reminded her of Joseph, and handing a scholarship check to a young student with dreams of being a designer. Nathaniel was always there, a quiet presence by her side. They built something together, not an empire of profit, but a legacy of compassion. Their wealth was not measured in stock prices or market caps, but in the number of lives they touched, the despair they turned into hope. It was a partnership forged in a filthy alley, a bond between a man who had lost everything and a woman who had so little to give, but gave it anyway, proving that the smallest act of kindness can be the investment that yields the greatest return of all. That's the incredible story of Maya Reyes and Nathaniel Kane. It's a powerful reminder that the person you are is not defined by your bank account, but by your actions in the moments that matter. Maya's simple daily act of kindness wasn't an investment she expected a return on. It was a pure reflection of her character. And in the end, that character proved to be the key that unlocked not just a fortune, but a future filled with purpose for them both. What would you have done in Maya's position? Do you believe that a single small act of compassion has the power to change the world, even just a small corner of it? We often walk past the Josephs in our own lives, never knowing the stories and the potential hidden behind their hardship. If this story moved you and reminded you of the power of the human heart, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share it with someone who might need a little dose of hope today. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable tales that prove that true wealth isn't what you have, but what you give. Thank you for listening.